thinking that Buddhism would have something to say about creating an ideal society. Actually, myself, I thought I'd learn meditation, I'd learn how to change my mind, all that sort of stuff. I wasn't kind of quite expecting that, but actually this is really, really important to Buddhism. It's a theme that's very important to Buddhism. And in a way, the reason why it's so important to Buddhism is because we're affected by conditions. Our conditions affect us. The conditions that we find ourselves in affect us majorly, actually. It may be that we're in conditions that actually prevent us from growing and practicing the Dharma. It may be that our conditions are so determining of our efforts to practice Buddhism that we need to change our conditions, for example. Or it may be that the conditions in our life allow it. But yeah, this is the reason why why Buddhism addresses this topic of how to create an ideal society. We need to find conditions that actually support our growth. So I'm sure we're all aware of that, aware of the effect, to some extent at least, of our conditions. But I think it's something that it easily goes out of focus, actually. We easily don't see the impact of our conditions. So it's really, yeah, it's really important to kind of bring that into focus for us to sort of talk about that. And when we talk about conditions, generally we mean sort of external conditions, don't we? We sort of mean the people around us, the kind of job we do, the kind of political society that we sort of live within. We mean sort of things external to us. But the reason why those are so important is because they affect the internal conditions. They affect the way we think. So the people we spend time with, the news we read, the things we do affect our minds. So that's what's actually happening. So in a certain way, this whole area, actually it runs very, very deep. We're basically talking about conditionality. We're starting to look at how our experience is actually a flow of conditions. Yeah, the thoughts we have, the moods that arise or pass. What are the conditions that kind of give rise to that? So I think, in a way, this is probably a more helpful way of thinking about what the Dharma is. To think in terms of conditions that give rise to the growth, development of consciousness. Conditions that we can put in place. I don't just mean in the external sense, I mean also meditation. If we kind of cultivate in our mind certain ideas, certain attitudes, if we do certain practices, they lead to the growth and development of ourselves, of our consciousness. So perhaps I'll come back to why I think that's an important way to be thinking about Buddhism, about the Dharma in a moment. Yeah, but it's easy to somehow not notice this. Actually, I think just because we've got an ego says, this is the way I am. That's the kind of mantra of the ego. This is the way I am. I'm not going to change. I'm always like this. So we have a certain experience and we think this is just the way I am. Little example, if you've been practicing Buddhism a bit and you go back to your family, you might think you've made a bit of progress. You go back to your family and there you are acting like a teenager all of a sudden. I don't know if you've had that experience, but it can be rather humiliating. You think you made a bit of progress and then one of your parents, you're both adults, one of your parents says something and you kind of go into a stroppy mood. What's happened? So conditions, because of conditions, something else has come into being in your mind. So it's a really, really good test, actually, just to sort of change our conditions and see what happens. Do we continue to meditate? Do we completely lose contact with our wish to meditate in different conditions? So yeah, supportive conditions are really crucial. So Buddhism has a lot to say about what those supportive conditions are, and the implications of that is that actually we need to take responsibility for the society that we find ourselves in. We need to start to create the conditions that lead to our growth and other people's. So I'll just keep an eye on time. So there's something that comes up here, perhaps not for all of us, it did for me to some extent, which is this whole area of influence. We sort of like to think that we're not so influenceable. We might even think of growth as becoming more independent, which in a certain way it is, but it can very easily lead us to think that what we need to do is become free of influences. We may even think that coming along to the Buddhist Center, you're being influenced. So how do we sort of negotiate this territory in a sort of helpful way, this area of influence? So yeah, I just wanted to explore this area a little bit, just see if it's kind of relevant for you, giving our online technician a challenge here, moving around. So this might be a little bit technical, but just I found it really interesting. So I was reading a book, Joanna Macy, by Joanna Macy, and in it she does a little potted history of causality in the West. What are our assumptions about how things happen? Which I found really, really interesting, because she says that our assumption, without us thinking about it, it's just there unconsciously, our dominant assumption, our dominant model of causality is linear causality. Yeah. So we tend to think that A is here and A is causing B. So in that model, A is the kind of agent of change. A has the power, and A makes B change. B is essentially passive. So this is kind of linear causality. Apparently that is our kind of predominant sort of model in our mind for how things happen. So A influences B. B is sort of passive, and you can see that kind of happening, can't you? So within a sort of power dynamic, so I've made the agent kind of bigger because it's kind of doing all the changing. It's got the power, and then there's little me there. So within a power dynamic, you can see sort of how that happens. I mean, just a really simple, not too dodgy power dynamic. You know, the doctor. You go to the doctor, and the doctor knows stuff about health, and I don't. So what the doctor tells me, largely, I think, oh, okay. But I've no idea, really, myself, whether it's good advice or not. So in that sense, the doctor really is the agent of the kind of changes, the medical procedures, the medicine I'm taking. They're sort of determining that. And that's fair enough, isn't it? It's fine. It's not very problematic. I suppose that's not just what we mean, though, is it, in a power dynamic? Power dynamics more recognizable when somebody has, well, maybe we're sort of building somebody up to be an authority. We sort of make someone into an authority. I was noticing this in my life. So just celebrated or marked 14 years I've been going out with my partner. But there was a time when, in a way, I'd sort of picked up a model of the spiritual life, a sort of narrow model of the spiritual life that was exclusively identified with lifestyle, the lifestyle of monasticism. That was the spiritual life. I'd kind of absorbed that idea. And there I was going to see my teacher, Sangha, and it's a little bit embarrassing this, but I said to him when I first went in, I said, "Oh, and my girlfriend says hi." Slightly odd because he's never met my girlfriend. You know, why was I saying that? And then I noticed later on in the conversation, I was inserting my girlfriend into the conversation, and I realized sort of a bit embarrassingly, I'd set Sangha up as an authority, telling me that I shouldn't have a girlfriend as part of the spiritual life, and I was rebelling against that. I was sort of saying no, you know. So why am I telling you all this? Yeah, with the authority, we sort of we make the authority into the agent, don't we? And we are just the passive. We are sort of changed by the agent. We are sort of powerless. So, yeah, that's perhaps what I've said there is more recognizable as a kind of power dynamic. And in a power dynamic, we do have a certain choice, don't we? We have a choice to conform to what we're being told to do, or to rebel. And I was just sort of rebelling. But the thing is, even if you're rebelling, it sort of appears like it's agency, doesn't it? But actually, the way we rebel, we still haven't sort of owned the decision we're making. We're still sort of, we still haven't really thought, what do I sort of think about this? We're kind of, we're acting in opposition. So in a way, our view is sort of entirely defined by the authority. Anyway, skipping on. So within Sangha, well, you do have the teacher. You could assume that the teacher is like an authority, as I was actually, the teacher and the disciple. So what is it that's going on in Sangha, and how is it distinct from a sort of power dynamic? Well, I'm going to throw Jeremy moving sides, but I need to. So what happens? So for me, I came along. So I mean teacher, just sort of in a broad sense, someone who's got more experience spiritually than I did, for example, when I first came along. So I came into contact with people who have more experience of Buddhism. They've been practicing Buddhism for longer than me. So you could, let's just simplify it and say that you know, they maybe kind of told me to go on retreat. Actually, what happened, one example is I was told that, well, vegetarianism, maybe it's not just a good thing to do, but actually, if you feel that's important, it's good for you as well to act in accordance with your values. So I came across that idea when I came along to the Buddhist Center for the first time. But what happened was I thought, oh, okay, I'll try that out. And as a consequence, I got bigger. As a consequence, my agency developed. I had a greater sense. So I became a vegetarian, and I felt better for it. Because I felt better, it wasn't just that I was acting in accordance with my values, it was also that I discovered my own agency. I discovered I can change my life. I can live according to my values. That changed me. It didn't just mean that I wasn't harming animals. So actually my agency increased. Yeah, that's the slightly bigger blob. That's what that's meant to indicate. So that is interesting, isn't it? So this idea of the agent, the powerful and the passive is starting not to apply. It's starting not to make sense. So because I developed greater agency, actually, I wasn't sort of determined by, I wasn't sort of stuck in a power dynamic. Actually, I could then choose, do I want to continue to come back to the center? There was a greater sense of agency. I could then choose more fully, what do I want to do? So, so the whole area of influence, basically, what I'm trying to, I hope I'm getting to this, the whole area of influence in a way is, it's unavoidable. We're asking the wrong question if we're asking, how can I avoid influence? Influence is just inevitable. It's an inevitable part of life. What we need to be asking is the influence that's conditioning me, that's about in my life, leading to greater agency? Am I developing agency? That's what we need to be asking. If we're developing greater agency, well, then we can choose the influences in our life. The problem with influence is when we get stuck in a sort of dependent relationship whereby we sort of project our power onto someone else and therefore remain small, powerless, without agency. Yeah, that's a real issue. So in a way, the whole question of influence is kind of irrelevant. You are being influenced. We're all being influenced kind of all the time. Actually, the key question is, are the influences in our life helping us develop agency? So what is said in Buddhism actually is that the teacher, in order to become a better teacher, needs good disciples. So in a Sangha dynamic, the teacher influences the disciple, and the disciple influences the teacher as well. So there's this kind of growth in agent, let's call it agency for now, for the disciple, but actually also for the teacher. The teacher kind of grows and grows too. So in Buddhism, actually, the kind of how things happen, it's not linear causality, it's mutual. It's mutual causality. We kind of mutually affect each other. Now, that's much closer to what my experience of Sangha has been. My experience of Sangha in this class, for example, my experience is actually that the way you turn up, the questions that you bring actually change me as well. I get influenced, I get kind of changed by this. But as I say, the key question to the issue of influence is agency. Anyway, so I just wanted to go into that. I hope I've skipped over it a little bit sort of quickly, but I just wanted to pause and see if there are any questions kind of bubbling up. This within a negative dynamic, it's important to realize that also is mutual. We generally think it's sort of it's linear. The bad teacher is the creator of the dynamic, and I can't do anything. But we always can. We can do something. So I don't think a bad teacher or an abusive teacher can teach you, but you can probably through coming into contact with other helpful conditions, you can take responsibility and realize, hang on a minute, I am playing a part in this by continuing to stay in relationship with this person. I actually have a choice here, and I realize that my choice is to move away from this this influence. Yeah, so essentially we're kind of it's us taking responsibility of seeing how we're sort of playing into a dynamic and taking responsibility. Yeah, so I don't think really an abusive teacher can teach us. I think it's us starting to take responsibility for the position that we've put ourselves into that's really giving rise to our growth. there. Great. So, yeah, just starting to move on. This point about growth in agency, growth in our ability to take responsibility for our lives so that we can find the conditions to grow. Essentially, it's the area of ethics in Buddhism. We can take responsibility for how we're acting and how that conditions our own mind and our lives, how it can give rise to greater agency. My example of vegetarianism, I found when I acted in a more ethical way, actually that gave rise to a greater sense of agency, out of which I could then take more responsibility for my life because a great sense of agency. And that's a sort of an exponential, a continuing growth, continued growth. So the teacher is a condition of possibility. Through coming into contact with someone more experienced, it gave rise to new possibilities for me, which can kind of continue to grow and grow. And that really is getting to what an ideal society is aiming at in Buddhism. So in Buddhism, Buddhism wants to reshape conditions such that it puts central the growth of responsibility of everybody who lives in that society. That's really what the ideal, the Buddhist ideal is. So much of our society kind of gives us a narrative which makes us sort of victims of circumstance, which tells us to blame. Subtly, we're kind of drawn into a kind of blame narrative, aren't we? Whereas Buddhism would try and encourage us to actually find our own responsibility, start to take responsibility for our lives. That's at the heart of what an ideal Buddhist society does. There's a little bit more to it than that, but that is absolutely sort of central to what an ideal Buddhist society tries to do. So, hey, Matt.
Your thoughts about the situation? Because I recently started a new job. It's related to this because I felt like in this job I was having my agency stripped away from me through a boss that was quite felt to me was being quite demanding in a way that was just undermining my ability to make decisions in the world. It was very much like do this. And I, in order to like regain my agency, verbalize this to her, and that ended in me losing my job. Right.
Sorry to hear that, Matt.
Yeah. It was a strange one because I felt like I was doing what I needed to do, but it resulted. I suppose my takeaway from that is it was just not the right place for me to be.
Yeah, well, that could be the case. Sometimes we find ourselves in conditions where we're so boxed in that we can't, it's having such a negative effect on us that we're actually kind of unable to grow, find our own initiative. And we do need to sort of take ourselves out of those sorts of situations. I mean, I think, I think it's a really good area to, if the more we are in contact with other people who have experience of the path and the dilemmas like you're talking about, and what to do in a challenging situation like that, you can kind of explore, what are my options here? What can I do here? Without knowing more about your circumstances, it's difficult to know what that might be. But that's what, well, coming into contact with the Sangha can sort of open up our options sometimes. Other times there aren't options, it's just, you're just going to have to leave, sort of thing. Yeah, it's not exactly a question, actually, is it? You're just sort of sharing your experience. Yeah, but it's helpful, Matt.
Yeah, I suppose. I thought it it was an attempt to regain my agency.
Yeah, yeah.
My own well-being.
Yeah, that's right.
It had a negative, I suppose,
Yeah,
connotation to its end result.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But maybe it wasn't.
It's really difficult to know, isn't it? It is really difficult to know. That might have been exactly what you needed to do. And it may have led to a greater sense of agency. You kind of tried to take responsibility. Yeah. And it may have led, it doesn't mean everything's going to work out all neatly by any means. So in the moment, it's hard to know. I think it's really hard to know. Yeah. Yeah. You'll find out over time. Yeah, great. Okay, so just to come back to this area of creating an ideal society, and the importance of conditions. What's really being got at is the fact that we individually cannot create all the conditions for our own growth. We can't do that. We can't do that ourselves, by ourselves rather. So this is the point about the Dharma, that we necessarily practice the Dharma ourselves. It's only ourselves who can really take responsibility for our mind and how we're acting, how it's leading us to act, our actions, moral agency. But we don't need to do that by ourselves. In actual fact, we probably can't do it by ourselves, i.e. alone. Do you see what I mean? So what we need to do is practice the Dharma ourselves, but actually do it with other people. We necessarily need to do it with other people, yeah. So that's why we need to think in terms of creating an ideal society, yeah. That brings up the question, what sort of society are we creating? And that brings up the issue of, do we have an ideal? Yeah. So in Buddhism, this is the ideal, that it encourages the agency, the personal responsibility of all individuals. That's quite a thing. It's quite a thing, really, to do. But I want to skip on to kind of how do we do this? How do you create this ideal society that's going to encourage us all to take responsibility for our own growth and development? Well, in order to answer that, we need to change the question a bit. We need to be asking, how do we do that? Because it needs to ask something of us, doesn't it? If we're talking about responsibility, it needs to be our responsibility. I think very easily with society, change in society, we tend to think that's going to be done by the politicians. Maybe we need to agitate and stuff. But actually, we need to be asking, how do we create this society? I hope that's obvious. If not, there'll be questions in the groups for you to explore it further. But skipping on, I want to come back to something that Padmabhadra a few weeks ago mentioned. He talked about these conditions, the Sangha vastus. Sometimes that gets translated as the means of unification, sometimes even the means of conversion. But what it's getting at is these are the conditions actually for creating this ideal society. And what's really interesting about these conditions is that they are things that we do. So they are generosity, dana, generosity, priyavadata, kindly speech, artacharya, beneficial, meaningful living, Padmabhadra translated it as, and then samanatata, exemplification. So they're all things that we do. They're all things that we do. So they're the conditions, or you could say the means for creating this ideal environment that is conducive to people really taking responsibility for their lives. So when thinking about this, I thought immediately about retreats, retreat environment. and actually how the kind of the social changes, experiments like community living and Buddhist businesses have grown out of retreats, grown out of people experiencing these environments, conditions that give rise to or encourage or allow the possibility, it's a conditionality of possibility of growth. So I don't know if you've all been on retreat. If you haven't, get on retreat. It's really interesting. We go on retreat and you find yourself there and you're in a different shaped world, aren't you? It's a world which is very collective. You eventually find out where you're sleeping and there's someone else there in my room. What are they doing? What are they doing in my room? So the kind of boundaries of our world are sort of shifted on retreat. We find ourselves in a very public sort of world, a very collective kind of world. So what's happened here is we've got a world that's shaped by this principle of generosity. What we don't realize with the opposite of generosity, which is possessiveness, is that our possessions, we don't just own, we don't just have use of them. They sort of metaphorically are placed between us and other people. That's really what's happening when we have possessions. That, you know, the most obvious one is your house, isn't it? You've got these kind of four walls that sort of box you off. There's a different principle that organizes kind of retreats, and that is actually a kind of sharing, a generosity. Just by coming on retreats, you're sort of entering into that kind of shaped world, a world where we share. We're sort of shifting how we relate to this aspect of property and possessiveness. We find ourselves in a kind of collective environment. The effects of that are really, you know, you don't even notice it's happening. You just think someone in my room. What are they doing in my room? But the effects of that are really interesting. We're kind of drawn together. There's a greater sense of connection that arises. We end up sort of telling each other things. It's a wonderful thing that happens on retreat. People just say what's going on with them in a way that most of the time we feel quite divided in society, divided from each other, don't we? There's, you know, a really interesting documentary on iPlayer a couple of years ago, talking about an epidemic of loneliness in our society, talking about it as an epidemic, actually. There's a tremendous amount of loneliness and isolation. Now, loneliness and isolation sound disagreeable and pleasant, but actually, it kind of closes down our possibility for growth. We're so sort of, I don't even quite know how to sort of describe how that is, but the best thing I can say is go on retreat and experience it. When we feel connected, all sorts of anxieties, all sorts of locked up energies, social anxieties, kind of sense of kind of self-recrimination or so, can fall away. And our energy is freed up just to get on with meditating, taking responsibility for our minds and therefore our lives. Yeah. So this aspect of connectedness is kind of it's a really crucial element of being able to grow. The way we connect is generosity. Generosity is the means through which we connect. As Sangha puts it, the very element of our possessiveness, our possessions, gets turned around to become the means of our connection. What divides us becomes the means for our connection. So this element, this means of creating an ideal society, creating an environment where we can take responsibility for our growth, the first one being generosity. The second one, so, oh yeah, I will mention, that's out of that, some people decided to change their living environment. Out of that grew experiments in kind of community living. There's a number of different communities around Cambridge of different sort of varieties. We're going to be hearing next week of somebody who lives in community, what that's like, and someone who doesn't live in community as well, how they've brought into play this means of creating or shaping their environment that is generosity, the first Sangha have asked to. So the second one, kindly speech. It might sound relatively feeble by way of a sort of means for changing society, kindly speech, but speech is tremendously powerful. It's also tremendously challenging trying to change it. Our speech is sort of closer in than action, closer into our minds. Our speech is more telling of what our real intentions are than our actions. You can kind of act generously, what appears to be generous, in order to sort of manipulate someone, can't you? Our speech, if someone's trying to get one over on you, the tone of voice, or maybe it's more noticeable actually in kindness. The tone of voice is a massive communicator, isn't it? If someone is being kind with you. I was hearing at the weekend an example of someone who'd said something quite challenging, he'd been quite firm, but the tone of voice was very, very kind. So this person knew, he found it quite upsetting actually to hear, but he knew that the intention was kindness, that the intention was to his benefit. Yeah. So speech can kind of communicate this to us, and the area of kindly speech, the power that kindly speech has as a means of transforming society, I think really comes into play when we bring to mind some of the experiments in livelihood actually that have gone on in this Buddhist community, throughout the Buddhist community. The workplace, we just heard about it, can be such a den of sort of harsh communication, can't it? Power, oppressive sort of communication. It can be fine, but there is this sort of power dynamic whereby someone has the decision to fire you or to allow you to work. They have the decision to allow you that training or not. How do you transform the working environment such that it's conducive to human growth? Well, speech is absolutely crucial. Kulipriya works in a Buddhist business and has many stories. We're going to be hearing someone talking about livelihood actually in a few weeks as well. But yes, kindly speech, it is possible to say difficult things to people with an awareness of them and what's of benefit to them. But how do they know that? Well, it's to do with the quality of our speech. That's what can communicate it. That's what can transform oppressive power dynamics into a dynamic where there can be genuine human give and take kind of communication. So this is, again, it naturally starts to happen on retreat. People start to speak in a kinder kind of way. Sometimes we take that even further to rejoicing in people's merits, telling people what we really appreciate about them. That happens. Actually, we often do that on the team, in the team on retreats before the retreatants kind of turn up. It brings about a really lovely human dynamic, actually, just by letting people know that you see their qualities. It's really transformative. It's powerful, actually. It's tremendously powerful. So the third one, Arthacharya, which Pabhavajra translated as meaningful living. And he said very much communicating the Dharma. When we're on retreat, we're in this sort of Dharma environment, aren't we? people are talking the Dharma, the influence, you know, we turn our phones off, media, the media is not kind of coming in, as long as you turn your phone off, is not coming into the retreat. We find ourselves kind of thinking in a more dharmic way, with dharmic sort of thoughts. We find ourselves taking responsibility. So if we can kind of, if we can live meaningfully, if we can learn the Dharma, practice the Dharma, then we can communicate the Dharma to other people. That's what we do on retreats. It's not like the teachers are the people who kind of give the Dharma. No, actually, we all do that by practicing it and then sharing. Through practicing it, we share our own experience of this kind of augmentative flow of conditions. Yeah. So meaningful living, Arthacharya. And the last one is exemplification. Actually, perhaps I should have gone into this one first. So this really gets to the heart of it. Our society can, you know, if we can't get away on a weekend and kind of live differently, live generously, live speaking with kindness, live meaningfully, truthfully. If we can't do that for a weekend, there's no hope, is there, for changing society? There's no hope for us. It really is a question of what can we do? Can we live differently? That is the real determinant of whether we can create an ideal society. So many, if you read history, which I've done to a certain extent, not half enough, there are so many examples, aren't there, of revolutions with high ideals and worthy sort of ideologies that are then oppressive regimes are overthrown. The French Revolution is a classic, isn't it? What replaced it was worse, because of lack of exemplification, people not actually able to live differently. So that is kind of key. When we go on retreat, you are invited to participate in a particular sort of life. Can we live like that? That's what's asked of you when you go on retreat. Can we live generously? Can we share? Can we speak kindly? And can we talk, think, engage with our experience in a truthful and kind of meaningful way? Can we practice the Dharma? That's what's asked of us. So these are the means for creating an ideal society, the Sangha of Vastus. So I think I'll leave it there. I've gone on slightly longer than I intended, actually, because I wanted to give you a bit more time for groups to discuss in groups. And you might want to discuss this area of agency, responsibility, initiative. What are the influences in your life that contribute to your sense of really being able to choose how you act? So first question. And the second question, what was the second question? Oh gosh, I haven't written it down. Oh dear, what was the second question? I was thinking about. Yeah, the second question is, how do you think about your spiritual life? Do you think that you can create all the conditions that you need? Or do you think in terms of actually, do you think socially? Do you think in these social means, generosity, kindly speech, going on retreat, all that sort of stuff? Do you think you need to kind of work on the collective aspect as well? Collective conditions as well. Yeah, so those two questions.